This morning we continue our series, 24 Hours That Changed the World, inspired by a book by Adam Hamilton. It's actually right here, 24 Hours That Changed the World. And just a short recap. Last week we talked about the Last Supper, what was commonly called the Passover Seder, which is just a meal, a celebratory meal that Jews gather together once a year and remember their sort of birth story. If you're familiar with the Exodus story, where God, through Moses, brought the people of Israel out of bondage, out of Egypt, into freedom, into the promised land. And so last week we talked a little bit about that. This week we're going to continue on that story and talk a lot about the garden and what happened in that garden, along very similar lines as that song that we just sang. So again, I gotta switch this around here, sorry about that. The Lord's Supper, they gathered together probably about 7 in the evening, and that lasted a good 4 hours, right? So it was a long celebration, a slow process of just eating and fellowshipping and remembering. So about 11 p.m., more than likely, they sang a hymn, probably drawn from Psalms 118, still commonly sung in a lot of traditional Seder celebration meals today. And so that's where we pick up the story, about 11 o'clock. And here we actually see Jesus at probably his most vulnerable. And a couple weeks ago, we learned a little bit about the power of vulnerability, and today we get a glimpse of Jesus displaying that vulnerability. For some of us, I think I grew up in the church, and it's easy sometimes to have this picture of Jesus almost ghost-like being, right? He's dressed in shining white, kind of glowing, and just kind of moves around from place to place. But today we're going to learn a very different part of the life of Jesus. And for some reason, through life experience, I think I'm drawn to passages such as this that show the humanity of Jesus. And that Jesus actually went through some struggles like you and I go through struggles. So where are we headed today? We're going to talk a little bit, drawing from a story in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to use that as a backdrop, and then we're going to trace a little bit of the steps that Jesus and his disciples took that night after they celebrated the Passover meal. And then we're going to come back to that gospel passage and kind of dissect it and zone in on the prayer of Jesus and ask a couple questions on what that might mean for us today living in the Phoenix area in the 21st century. So I want to invite you to read along with me the text. And as we do, I apologize, this screen took a little hit right here, if you can't tell. So you might not be able to read this well, so feel free to look on the sides and follow along there. But starting in verse 32, it says, "They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' He took with him Peter, James, and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, 'I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake.' And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, 'Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want.'" And then if we were to continue read, we would find out, as the song we sang, or we listened to, that was sang over us, that Jesus then picked up and went back to his disciples, found that they were sleeping, kind of woke them up, right? "Please pray with me," and then goes back and prays again. And then comes back, finds his disciples asleep again, and goes back and returns to pray. And so I think we're meant to get this picture of not only Jesus in anguish and enduring a lot of internal strife, but also feeling a little alone in this time. And so as we begin, the next slide here is going to be a little map to kind of give us a background of tracing the steps of Jesus and the disciples. So on the very bottom left, we're going to start there. There's a little box, and that's probably where what is considered the upper room, which is the room that the disciples and Jesus celebrated the Last Supper or the Passover Seder. And from there, they left that room, and they crossed over the Kidron Valley. We'll see a modern-day picture of that here in a little bit. And then on the other side of that valley, at the base of the Mount of Olives, there was an olive grove, where there was a bunch of olive trees scattered around. And that's where this story takes place. And so just a few things of interest. The garden wasn't miles and miles away. And in fact, you could look out just right across the valley, which we'll see here in a little bit, but you could see the temple from the Garden of Gethsemane from there. It's only 3/4 of a mile walk, and it takes, if you were to walk it would take about 25 minutes. Again, it was in the evening. They probably started around 11 o'clock, so they probably had torches. So they arrive in this garden at about 11:30 p.m. The next picture we have here is a modern-day picture of what that area looks like. The top center, where it says Mount Moriah, right next to it, you can see a little bit of the Dome of the Rock, which is sort of that building with the golden dome on there. That was a Temple Mount during the time of Jesus. Somewhere in between the Mount Moriah and the Central Valley area, probably where the upper room was. So you can kind of see and retrace a little bit of the steps, the disciples and Jesus following along probably that wall area, and then you can see how the Kidron Valley kind of dips down, and then on the far side is the Mount of Olives, but they didn't journey all the way up there. It was somewhere on the base where they had the olive grove. So the next picture actually gives us a little more of a glimpse of what the Garden of Gethsemane looks like today. There's a few trees left. There was probably many more during the time of Jesus. An interesting fact is many believe that some of these trees are 3,000 years old, which means that during the time of Jesus and his disciples, that some of these trees existed for 1,000 years before that. So some of these trees might have been the trees that Jesus prayed under or the disciples sat around. Just out of curiosity, is there anyone that's ever been to these sites and traveled and seen? We have one. I know Pastor Ryan and John. Okay, there's a few of them. I'm super jealous. I would imagine this would be one of the neatest things to go to this garden and to see this, to sit there, to touch the trees that Jesus and the disciples may have touched this night. And so we're going to pick up again the scripture, jumping back. Mark chapter 14, we're going to read the first 2 verses again. And it says, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. And we get this picture again of the group of disciples journeying to this garden. And for whatever reason, most of them staying in a place. And Jesus picks 3 of them, Peter, James, and John. Many people believe that those were the 3 closest friends of Jesus. We read here in like this story and the story of the Lord's Supper, where they were seated in places of honor, and other places in the gospel where they seem to be very closely associated with Jesus. So it seems like Jesus leaves some of his friends, some of the disciples, and then he takes 3 of his closest and moves a little deeper into that garden. And something shifts here because Jesus begins to reveal himself a little more to these 3, his closest friends. And so we read that he began to be distressed and agitated. And so we have a sense of some of the things Jesus might have been going through, right? Probably while celebrating the Lord's Supper or the Passover Seder, trying to be in that moment, trying to savor that time, trying to reflect and remember. And now as he's journeying to this garden, he arrives, he's looking forward, maybe anticipating what is to come, and knowing that whatever it is, it's going to be extremely difficult, and having that sense of weight and heaviness. And so we continue to read that he actually threw himself to the ground. So he walked a little bit farther after he left Peter, James, and John and threw himself to the ground. And so again, you get the weight, the heaviness that was on Jesus' shoulders, the weightiness of what was going on. I would imagine that there's probably some of us here who've gone through things where it has felt extremely heavy, where there's been times where it's hard to even stand up because the weight of whatever's going on is weighing upon us. And so Jesus is experiencing that. And then we're going to hone in here. And he says an interesting prayer. And this is where we're going to kind of camp out for the rest of the time. And he says, the text says that if it were possible that the hour might pass from him. And then Jesus says, Abba, which Abba is just an Aramaic term for father, but probably a more intimate term, so maybe even something like daddy. So he's crying out, Daddy, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup. So it's interesting that Jesus prays here, God, please take this away. God, please don't let this happen. And in a sense, Jesus is praying a prayer that doesn't get answered. Because we find out later that we know what happens. Does the cup get taken away? Now, so Jesus prays a prayer that doesn't get answered here. I'm willing to bet that probably all of us in this room have prayed prayers that have gone unanswered before. So what do you do with unanswered prayers? It's kind of the first question that we wrestle with and we draw out of here. What do you do with unanswered prayers? So I know before my wife and I had our kids, we were going back to school and trying to figure out on our way to go back to school, what does this mean? Where are we going to go to school? How's this going to work? And my wife researched this school. It was in the Midwest, and she got really excited. We felt like, okay, let's apply. She went out, she traveled, she visited the school, visited the city. We got really, really excited. We felt like, yes, this is it. So we prayed. Yes, we felt like God was saying, this is it. So we just continued to pray. God, open the doors. God, allow us to get in, allow us to find a place. And our whole life began to be about that destination. And then a couple months later, we get a letter. You probably know where this is going, right? And it says, we regret to inform you. That kind of letter. Kind of a downer, right? And so tears were shed. A lot of why. You're facing that. It's rejection, of course. It's like, am I not good enough? I felt like this was God's will. I felt like this is where God was leading us to. Why? And so you're stuck wrestling with that. What do you do with unanswered prayers? And so probably in here, many of us have probably prayed for something that we haven't received. I know we have friends that have prayed to be parents, and for whatever reason, that has not happened. And that can be extremely difficult. I mean, compared to like getting into a college, this is a lot more weightier, right? When people around you are having kids, and you're praying, God, please let me have kids, and then they're having kids, and you're dealing with mixed emotions within you, some forms of jealousy and envy and not sure why God, and you're trying to struggle through all that, and your prayers aren't being answered. That's just one example of a very difficult time, a very difficult unanswered prayer, right? Other times we pray for something not to happen. Something is going to happen, or you fear that you're going to lose your job, or that there's a relationship in your life that's really struggling, and so you pray, God, please allow this to make it through, and then sometimes it doesn't happen. And so what do we do when our prayers aren't answered? And so today, I don't have an answer for that. It's a question that we wrestle with. And in fact, when people give an answer to that, I struggle because there's so many layers to those questions. And there's so many different things. Sometimes we look back in hindsight, like us not getting into that college, and we're like, oh, we wouldn't be here right now if we did. And we can be thankful now, years later. But sometimes that's not always true. Sometimes you look back years later and you're still, I have no idea why. I'm still lost for that. But I think what we can do is we can find comfort in this story here, in the fact that Jesus was a human and experienced a lot of the things that we experience when our prayers don't go answered, right? That Jesus probably experienced loneliness, fear, pain. And those are hard emotions sometimes for us to think like, oh, Jesus, again, he's not this ghost-like figure moving, but he's a human person living and experiencing that pain. And I think we can find comfort in that. And so we're moving on. Jesus prays, not what I want, but what you want. In other translations, it says, not my will, but your will be done. And in many ways, it's an answer or an extended prayer of not having that prayer answered. It's a way of saying, this is what I pray, this is what I hope, but it's also a way of surrendering and trusting, right? And it can be a powerful prayer. I'm going to be brutally honest. It can also be a struggle for me at times to understand passages like this. And I think for a lot of people, not my will, but yours be done. And I think somewhere along the line, again, I was raised in church. I picked up this idea that God is sort of like a hierarchical being, or like an authoritarian parent, kind of like The Godfather. Anybody seen that movie, The Godfather? So kind of like The Godfather, where you do what he says you do, or else, right? And so passages like this can be a struggle sometimes for those of us that might have that idea or that vision of God, right? It's very fear-based. And some of us kind of grew up with that and we're soaked in that, and it can be a struggle. And how do we understand this passage? Not my will, but yours be done. Can almost seem like God's got Jesus sitting underneath God's thumb, holding Jesus down. Jesus is sort of squirming a little bit and finally say, I give, and God just squashes, We can have that picture. It can be. I mean, we laugh jokingly, but I know there's a number of people that struggle with these ideas and these images of God. So I'm going to suggest a different way of seeing this. It's a way that's worked for me. And this way is influenced by a line of thought called process theology. Process theology is just one aspect, a way of thinking of things. I don't buy into any one way of thinking, hook, line, and sinker. But in process thought, basically, as it applies to this text, God works always through persuasion and never through coercion. God works always through persuasion and never through coercion. And what that means then in my life, in my experience, is that God always works through the gentle whispers, right? The times in my life where I sense something within me say, hey, Aaron, you see that person over there? You see how they're hurting? Can you step out and help them a little bit? Or my spirit feels moved by my compassion. I see something. I see brokenness. And so I feel moved. I'm like, I gotta do something, right? I think that's God working in my life through persuasive means. Not trying to force me to do something, but act in a certain way. My conscience is another way. Sometimes I do things, and afterwards I think, oh no, I shouldn't have done that. Oh no, I feel so bad. Or sometimes it might be unintentional, like I hurt someone or offended someone, and they've come back and they said that. Now I gotta deal with my own ego. I gotta humble myself. Maybe I didn't mean to, but deal with my conscience. And that small nudge, what I would say is God's leading in my life. Does that make sense a little bit? And so there's a different way of understanding that. And so coming back to the passage, not my will, but yours be done. What could that possibly mean here? Again, one way to see it could be like an authoritarian God figure saying, this is my will, do it or else. Or another way could be to see it as Jesus was walking into those nudges, was feeling that draw in his entire life, was walking in that path. And we see that he was seeing injustice and pointing out injustice. He was seeing unhealthy forms of religion, as we talked about in our last series, and coming up against that, right? And following God's nudge, God's move, God's will in his life. And as he walked into that, now he gets to this garden where he feels alone. He feels the weight of what's going to happen, where this journey is headed, right? He feels that weight. So he stops for a moment and says, I don't know if this is where I want to go. God, please, if there's any other way, God, please, can you find out, is there anything else I could do, right? And yet I think he comes back at the end of this prayer, not my will, but yours be done, and finally says, yeah, but something within me says this is right. This is what I need to do, right? And the power structures, he knew the power structures don't like that, right? And that when we follow that, sometimes there is a cost. When we follow that, sometimes there is a cost. And when I say power structures, I mean power structures are in every single sphere of life. There's power structures within religion. There's power structures within education. There's power structures within government and within business. And the power structures are those structures where people begin to be greedy, right? It's what is in it for me. I want to profit more. I want more wealth. I want more success. I want more power. And then begin to exploit or marginalize other people, right? And what happens when you have a prophetic person like Jesus come out and feel that nudge and speak out against those injustices? Well, those power structures don't like that. I think this is happening today in every single sphere. We can see it all across the board, right? And so Jesus steps out. And so one thing we can gather from this. The last question I'm going to raise here this morning is, am I willing to follow God's leading? Right? Am I willing to follow God's nudge, whatever the cost might be in my life? So there's a story I recently heard. It's a story of a Catholic priest from Belgium, and his name was Father Damien. And Father Damien, he's a young man, and he learned that the Catholic Church was looking for missionaries to Hawaii. So, hey, Hawaii, right? I mean, suffer for Christ. Sounds, not a bad place. I've been there. I love it. I wouldn't mind. God, if you want to send me, I'm willing. So he moves. In 1864, Father Damien moves to Hawaii as a Catholic priest. And he gets to Hawaii, and he comes to the knowledge that there's been an outbreak of leprosy, now called Hansen's disease. And what they had done at that time is they decided to relocate all the lepers to the island of Molokai, right? And there was nothing on the island of Molokai at that time, so they had to rebuild villages, homes, find food, find ways of living. And so he comes in the middle of that, right? And the Catholic Church realizes, hey, we need people there to minister to those people too. And so I can imagine Father Damien sitting back in a very similar place as Jesus probably on that garden, right? Feeling maybe a nudge, like, oh, maybe I could do this. But he's young, he's 33 years old, right? And probably said, I've given so much already. I've gone to Hawaii, I'm here serving the people, right? I could live a long life here. And yet wrestling with that in the same way Jesus may have been wrestling with the call, that nudge for him. And again, I don't think it's a way of follow God or else you're going to get punished and God's going to hate you. But I think it's an internal, I sense God saying, this is the way I should go. And so Father Damien, he set forth. Here's a picture of him. I think he's about 33 here, right before he decided to go. So he went to the island of Molokai. He built a church, and he helped people there, the leper colony, build houses, food, shelter. He helped bury those, take care of those, 16 years. And of course, it was basically, he knew it was a death sentence. And so he lasted there 16 years and eventually died of leprosy himself. And so what an awesome story of someone who followed that nudge. In a way, he said, not my will, but yours be done. And so I think there's a lot we can draw from that story in our own life. Now, it might not be that we'll be in Hawaii faced with that same choice, okay? It's probably unlikely. But there's choices every day that we face in the 21st century. Choices, are we going to follow that nudge, that leading of where we feel like God is calling us to do? So it might be a choice, it might be something like making a meal for someone. Somebody you know is sick in the hospital, had a baby, make a meal or make several meals, or go over and help out with their house. You feel that nudge to do that, to step out in that way. It might mean helping out with kids ministry here at church. Shameless plug right there. I direct the kids ministry, so if you ever do want to, there it is. It might mean a simple act as giving someone a smile. And I had somebody pull me aside a couple of weeks ago, and a wise person said, I can't change the world, but I can give people smiles and change their day. And I thought, that's awesome, because the simple act, when somebody smiles at you, what do? Smile back, right? And it's a simple act that changes your countenance, right? It might be a simple act of holding the door open for someone. And this is neat. I was writing my sermon at a coffee shop, and I closed my computer after writing that sentence, and I get out, and I walk down. It was like a shopping center. So I walked down, and there was this older gentleman, and he pulled the door open for this lady. And then this lady, right after I wrote this sentence, and this lady said, oh, wow, what a rare treat. Thank you so much. And you could just see, she just lit up. Just that simple act of kindness, right? Change somebody's day, enhance their day, influence their day, right? It might mean simply helping out a neighbor or a friend at a chore around the house, right? You know that they need help, or extending that. Hey, if you ever need a hand, here I am. If you ever need help mowing the lawn, setting that up, whatever it is. It could be other things, helping people babysit. There's so many other different ways. But the question is, what is that nudge for you? And are you following that nudge? Again, because I believe God is always working through persuasive means, leading us into greater health, greater healing, greater wholeness, helping other people get there. So what does it mean in our own context to follow Jesus as he himself wrestled with that, right? The unanswered prayer, the struggle, the pain that he was enduring. But at the end of the day, then he came and says, not my will, but yours be done. And it's a simple prayer, but it's an easy prayer no matter where we are on our faith journey. So whether we're just starting out or maybe even uncertain, it might be the simple prayer, not my will, but yours be done. And you could tweak it a little bit in a sense saying, God, I don't know. I'm not sure you exist. I don't know what you want from me, but here I am. Please open up. Please tell me. Please guide me. Please lead me. And we do that. It doesn't matter how long we've been on that journey. It's the same prayer, right? It's deeper. God, here I am. What's next? Where do you want from me? Let me listen to that nudge. And knowing sometimes it may cost something. Sometimes it's a little cost, a smile, holding the door open. And sometimes it may be stepping out and moving somewhere else, doing something else. In closing, maybe one of the hardest things about living in sort of suburban America is that it's easy to turn inward and to live for self. Keeping up with the Joneses, right? It's easy to look at, oh, so-and-so bought a bigger house. What about ours? Ours isn't quite as big. Or so-and-so bought nicer cars. Ours aren't quite as nice. Our kids aren't, whatever. It can go and go and go. And it's easy to turn in and just think about self only, right? And so maybe that might be the biggest struggle of living in sort of suburban America. And what would it mean then to rearrange your lifestyle a little bit? I know some people that live minimalistic lifestyles. They bike or walk places, right? Other people, it might just be, how can we rearrange whatever lifestyle we have to live in a way where we can follow that nudge, that opens up that nudge? My wife and I, we're praying and talking about that even now. We're both students, so we live a pretty minimalistic lifestyle because we're forced to right now. But we're having conversations too of in 5 years when we're out of school and we both have jobs, how do we want to live? What kind of house do we want to buy? What kind of car do we want to have? How can we set up so we're not stressed and so we have an opportunity to follow those nudges? So wherever we are today, it's the simple prayer that Jesus prayed 2,000 years ago. Not my will, but yours be done.